They say there was a black slave man who allegedly lived 130 years and was forced to mate and breed more than 200 children. Who would have believed such a tale? But hey, almost anything could have been possible in the era of slavery. So let me give you the full story here today. Roque Jose Florencio, also known as Pata Seca, was an enslaved African who lived in Brazil under harsh conditions and was treated with extreme inhumanity. It's thought that he was born in Africa in the early 1800s. However, the story of his existence was centered on his work as a breeder when he was purchased to sire children for his owner. On the farm where he worked, it was customary for slaves to be given animal names, and because of his tall stature, slender legs, and huge hands and feet, he was given the nickname Pata Seca, which translates to dry paw in English. Pata Seca was a Sao Paulo farmer's property. However, he didn't lead a life of servitude. This was because he had a good relationship with his owner, Francisco Dakin Habueno, who trusted him with responsibilities like mail delivery and animal care. This responsibility required him to ride his horse every day between the rural village and the city of São Carlos. With his amazing height of 7 feet 2 inches or 2.18 meters, he was considered the ideal candidate for the post of breeder. This gave him a unique position as a slave because he did not work in the fields or reside in the slave quarters. But before we go any further, what in the world does slave breeding mean and why was it so important for slave owners? Slave breeding was considered to be a deeply dehumanizing and brutal practice, as enslaved women were repeatedly sexually abused by their masters or other enslaved men to get them pregnant. Several factors contributed to the rise of slave breeding in the Americas. The first one was the Partus Sequitur Ventrum statute, enacted by the Virginia House of Burgesses in the early 1700s. According to this regulation, the offspring of enslaved women were likewise slaves, regardless of the status of the father. Another reason was the rapid rise in cotton business growth in southern United States in the early 1800s. This was another big factor that contributed to the rise of slave breeding. Cotton was a very labor-intensive crop, and slave owners needed a large workforce to produce cotton. Logically, slave breeding allowed slave owners to increase their workforce without having to purchase new slaves from Africa. It's some really messed up logic at this point, right? Another factor that necessitated slave breeding was the decline of the transatlantic slave trade. Slave imports from Africa were prohibited in the United States in 1808. This made it more difficult and expensive for slave owners to acquire new slaves. You'd think they'd learn, but no, they didn't. In the 1830s, the American South earned the moniker breeding ground of the nation. This was due to the fact that the slave population in the southern states was higher than what was required for local labor needs. See, slave owners in the southern states gained money off of the reproduction of slaves by selling them to other states. Lastly, slave breeding was really profitable for slave owners. They could sell the children of enslaved women for a high price, and they could also use them to increase their slave workforce. So where does Pata Seca come into the picture? Because of the superstitions of the time, tall men with slim legs were thought to have a higher propensity to have sons, which was highly desired for labor-intensive activities. Pata Seca was thus made to do the menacing chore of being the farm's breeder, charged with fertilizing the female slaves. The lineage of Pata Seca, which spans generations, was created with the sole purpose of enhancing his owner's workforce. He received a thorough physical and medical examination for infections, food, and care as though he were an animal. The precise number of women Pata Seca interacted with or how frequently he did it was unknown, but it's thought that he left behind more than 240 children who passed his DNA onto numerous generations of slaves. Finally, in 1888, slavery was abolished, ushering in a new era for Pata Seca marked by opportunities and freedom never experienced before. Pata Seca found love and married Palmyra. In their marriage, they had 9 kids, and together they formed a stable family. He began to build a new life as a free man on the land his old master had given him. To bring his ambitions to fruition, Pata Seca set off on a quest by embracing the life of a farmer and focused all of his efforts on providing a better life for his family. In the middle of the fields where he grew and sold sugarcane, he built his estate, Sitio Pata Seca. Although his wages remained low, they provided the sustenance for his family's welfare and the growth of his ambitions. His commitment persisted for years. However, one fateful morning, disaster struck Pata Seca's life when he tripped over a nail. Despite obtaining initial treatment from a nearby healer, Pata Seca's condition quickly deteriorated as a result of the injury that resulted in tetanus. On June 13, 1958, Pata Seca attained the amazing age of 130, marking the end of his life's adventure. We don't know for sure if he really lived 130 years given the circumstances of slavery, but we do know that he lived for a long time. So, with this tragic ending, what are the consequences of slave breeding that we've learned from the life of Pata Seca? Although Pata Seca did not experience the same hardships as other slaves, it was horrifying and traumatizing that his humanity was taken away from him when he was made the first person to breed with black women slaves on demand on such a large scale. The terrible reality of that oppressive regime made Pata Seca function as a slave breeder. Slavery was more than just simply forced labor. It was a wicked scheme to perpetuate itself by creating new generations of enslaved people. Humans were put through a degrading process that disregarded their privileges and freedom, turning them into nothing more than equipment, right next to animals. As a sign of true acknowledgement of the wrong done to the black race, we've got to study the effects of this horrible history and chronicle certain facts. Stay with me for this one. So what happened to Pata Seca's kids? The story of Roque's descendants became a heartbreaking and painful one because their formative years were filled with difficult labor. Pata Seca had a remarkable track record of having 249 children in all, of which the majority were born to enslaved women and the remainder to free women who either fell in love with him or hired him for his services. Like any good father would, Pata Seca wanted to prevent his children from being sold into slavery by teaching them how to read and write, as well as how to fight and survive. Their innocent youth was ripped away while others were made to labor on the land owned by their owners. They were robbed of their humanity, rights, feelings, and freedom to choose their own paths, which is a terrifying fact. Their owners controlled their lives, and like puppets, they pulled on the strings for their entire lives. Breeding slaves was a cruel practice that lacked any kind of compassion. It was a callous, dehumanizing tactic to maintain a steady workforce, extending the cycle of agony. Well, that's where we draw the curtain for this video. So tell me, what do you think of the actions of the slave owners this time? What do you think was the most disgusting part of the story of Pata Seca? Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, because again, it really does help us get our content out there. And as always, everybody, my brothers and sisters and everything in between, thanks for choosing to spend your time with us today. We'll see you in our next video.